In 1989, a farmer in rural Anhui province in China and a farmer in Bihar earned roughly the same money. Their kids had similar chances of making it past age 5. Both governments were corrupt, broke, drowning in the kind of poverty that doesn't just empty your pockets, it crushes your spine. If someone had asked you in 1989 to bet on which country would become the factory of the entire planet, you'd have flipped a coin. Honestly, you might have picked India. India had courts that worked. India had democracy. India had English-speaking graduates everywhere. And China was still picking up the pieces from a famine that killed somewhere between 15 and 55 million people. I'll come back to that number. So what the hell happened? Because something clearly happened. Today, China's economy is roughly 5 to 6 times the size of India's. 5 to 6 times. And when people try to explain this, they always say the same lazy stuff. Oh, China's authoritarian, so they just force people to work. Oh, China got lucky. Oh, it's a population thing. None of that is the real answer. The real answer is about money, who understood it, who moved it first, and who got completely played by it. That's the story I want to tell you today. And fair warning, it's not a comfortable one. Let's rewind. 1947, India gets independence. 1949, Mao declares the People's Republic of China. Both countries start from the same wreckage. India had been hollowed out by the British for 2 centuries. And I don't mean they took some taxes, they deindustrialized the country. India once produced nearly a quarter of the world's GDP, and the British left it with almost nothing. China had it arguably worse. Opium Wars, Japanese invasion, a civil war that ripped the country apart. By the time both nations stood up and dusted themselves off, they were looking at the same empty horizon, asking the same question. Now what? And here's what's funny in the darkest way possible. For the next 30 years, both countries made almost identical mistakes. Never went socialist. Central planning, massive state-owned enterprises, and something called the License Raj, a bureaucratic nightmare so thick that if you wanted to manufacture a single screw you needed permits from ministries you didn't even know existed. Meanwhile, Mao did the same thing but cranked it to 11. His great leap forward in 1958 was supposed to industrialize China overnight. Instead, it caused the worst famine in human history. That number I mentioned, 15 to 55 million dead, because one government decided it understood farming better than farmers. Then came the Cultural Revolution, another decade of insanity. Scientists humiliated in public, factories closed, an entire generation lost. So by the late 1970s, both countries were in terrible shape. India growing at what economists mockingly called the Hindu rate of growth, barely 3.5%, not even keeping up with population. China recovering from wounds it had inflicted on itself, equal on paper, equally broken in reality. This is where things split. 1978. A short chain-smoking man named Deng Xiaoping takes power in China. And he does something nobody, not the CIA, not the Kremlin, not even most Chinese officials, sees coming. He doesn't publicly trash Mao's system. He doesn't give grand speeches about capitalism. He just quietly starts rewiring the entire financial machinery of the country. His famous line, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." Meaning, forget ideology, show me results. But here's the part they don't teach you. Deng's reforms were never about freedom. They were about a smarter kind of control. He set up special economic zones along the coast, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, a few others. Small cities nobody outside China had heard of. Foreign companies could come in, set up factories, use cheap labor, export goods with almost no regulation. On paper it looked harmless, just some experiments. But Deng understood something India's leaders completely missed. In the modern world, the country that makes stuff wins. Not the country with the biggest army or the most nuclear warheads, the country that manufactures things. Because manufacturing earns you foreign currency. Foreign currency lets you buy resources. Resources let you build infrastructure. Infrastructure lets you manufacture more. It's a loop. And once that loop starts spinning, it's nearly impossible for anyone else to catch up. And then China did something genuinely ruthless with its banking system. The state-owned banks became a machine with one job: pump money into infrastructure and manufacturing. Roads, not normal roads. 8-lane highways cut through mountains connecting cities that didn't exist 10 years before. Deep water ports, power plants, coal, hydro, nuclear, whatever works, just build it. And they funded all of it with debt, insane amounts of debt. But internal debt. China borrowed from itself. State banks lent to state construction companies to build state infrastructure. The money never left the system. It just went round and round, getting faster and bigger. Western economists kept screaming bubble. Ghost cities, they said. It'll collapse, they said. They've been saying it for 30 years now. It hasn't collapsed. Because China wasn't playing by anyone else's rules. It was writing its own. If you're finding this interesting and you want more stuff like this, just hit subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. But let's keep going. Now, what was India doing this whole time? Still stuck in the license Raj. Want to start a business? Get in line. Want to import a computer? Fill out 17 forms. Want to export textiles? Talk to this ministry, then that ministry, then this committee, then wait 6 months and maybe someone calls you back. India wasn't just slow. India was actively strangling its own people who wanted to build something. And the banking system was a mess. Loans given based on political connections, not merit. Bad debts piling up like garbage nobody wanted to collect. There was no grand plan. No one sitting in a room mapping out the next 50 years. Just the next election. Always the next election. Then 1991 happened. And every Indian alive should understand what 1991 actually means. India ran out of money. Not metaphorically. Literally. Foreign exchange reserves dropped so low the country could barely cover 2 weeks of imports. exports. 2 weeks, a nation with nuclear weapons and satellites in space was weeks away from defaulting on its loans. India had to physically load gold onto airplanes and fly it to the Bank of England as collateral just to get an emergency IMF loan. Picture that for a second. Gold bars on a cargo plane to London because the bills were due and the wallet was empty. That was India in 1991. Out of that humiliation came reform. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh opened up the economy, cut tariffs, invited foreign money, started dismantling the license Raj, and it worked. Growth picked up, IT boomed, Bangalore became a global name, the middle class exploded. But here's what nobody wants to admit. India's liberalization in 1991 came 13 years after China's in 1978. 13 years. And those 13 years aren't just a gap, they're a canyon. Because while India was debating whether Pepsi should be allowed to sell cola, China was laying the concrete and steel foundation that would make it the world's factory. That head start has never been closed, not for a single day, because this gets worse. By the early 2000s, China made a decision most people didn't notice. It decided it wouldn't just make other people's stuff anymore. It would create its own. Billions poured into R&D, artificial intelligence, 5G, semiconductors, battery tech, electric vehicles. And here's the move that was either brilliant or sinister, depending on where you're standing. China told every foreign company that wanted access to its market, sure, come on in, but first share your technology with a Chinese partner. You want to sell cars here? Teach a Chinese firm to build the engine. You want to build phones here? Hand over your manufacturing secrets. Western companies agreed because 1.4 billion consumers was too juicy to resist. They walked in with blueprints. They walked out with market access. But China walked out with knowledge. And knowledge is the only currency that actually compounds forever. By 2010, China wasn't copying anymore. Huawei built 5G networks cheaper and arguably better than Nokia or Ericsson. BYD started making electric cars that could rival Tesla at half the price. TikTok became the most downloaded app on earth. And behind every single one of these companies, state subsidies, cheap loans, free land, dirt cheap electricity, China wasn't competing in a free market. It was engineering outcomes using every lever the state had. And it worked spectacularly. India during the same period, debating FDI and retail, debating whether to privatize Air India, debating farm reforms until farmers marched on Delhi and the reforms got scrapped, debating land acquisition until infrastructure projects sat in courts for a decade. And look, I'm not saying debate is bad. Democracy is valuable. But there's a line between deliberation and paralysis, and India spent too many years on the wrong side of that line. The result? India became a services economy. A good one, honestly. Indian engineers are in every major tech company on the planet. But services don't build nations the way manufacturing does. Services don't employ hundreds of millions of unskilled workers who need a way out of poverty. China understood this. India, for a very long time, did not. And then there's the global debt game. This is where China went from regional power to something that should genuinely keep you up at night. The Belt and Road Initiative. On paper, it's infrastructure aid. China builds roads, ports, and railways in developing countries. Sounds nice, right? Here's how it actually works. China lends money to a country that probably can't afford it. That country uses the money to hire Chinese construction firms. So the money flows right back to China. And when the country inevitably can't repay, China takes the asset. Sri Lanka couldn't pay for the Hambantota port. China got a 99-year lease. Pakistan is buried in Chinese debt. Zambia allows Djibouti. The list keeps growing. This is the East India Company playbook, rewritten for the 21st century. Same game, different weapons. Bankers instead of soldiers. Contracts instead of cannons. So where does India stand in all this? Honestly, caught in the middle. China building military infrastructure along the border. Ladakh standoffs. Doklam. Constant pressure along the line of actual control. This isn't just some territorial dispute. It's economics by other means. China wants India to fill the gap. And the gap isn't just GDP, it's capability. China can build a hospital in 10 days. India sometimes can't build a highway in 10 years. China has lifted over 800 million people out of poverty since 1978. India still has more people in extreme poverty than any country on earth. Those aren't opinions. You can look them up tonight. But, and I mean this, it's not a hopeless story for India. India has things China doesn't. India's population is young. China's is aging fast, thanks to the one-child policy coming back to bite them. India has a startup ecosystem that's genuinely impressive. India has democracy which, for all its messiness, prevents the kind of catastrophic top-down disasters that authoritarian systems produce. Amartya Sen made this point years ago. A Mao's famine couldn't have happened in a democracy because a free press would have raised the alarm. India has that free press. India has that noisy, chaotic, beautiful democracy. Long-term, that might matter more than any bullet train. But the long term is a luxury, and right now the short term belongs to China. The real lesson from all of this isn't that China is good and India is bad. It's not that dictatorship beats democracy. The lesson is darker and simpler. Money doesn't wait. Capital doesn't care about your parliamentary session or your 5-year plan or your election promises. It moves. It goes where it's treated best. For 40 years, China treated money like a weapon, aimed it carefully and fired without blinking. India treated money like a guest it wasn't sure it wanted in the house. One country built a machine. The other built a committee to discuss whether the machine was a good idea. Next time someone tells you India is catching up, that this is India's century, ask them one thing. Ask them where the factories are, where the chips are made, who builds the batteries, the solar panels, the drones, the ports, who owns the debt of half the developing world. And when they go quiet, you'll understand. This race wasn't decided on a battlefield or in a parliament. It was decided in a bank, in a boardroom, in a policy document nobody read, signed on a night when both countries looked identical on paper. China woke up in 1978. India woke up in 1991. Those 13 years are the most expensive snooze button in history, and we're still paying for it.